The sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the bustling airport below. Travelers moved like ants through the terminals, some rushing with excitement, others weighed down by the heaviness of long journeys ahead. Among them was a woman named Lily, clutching her small suitcase as she navigated through the crowd. Her face was calm, but her heart was restless. It had been years since she'd left her hometown, and now she was returning, carrying with her memories she wasn't sure she was ready to face again. Lily glanced at the flight board overhead. Flight 837, destination, Seattle. She took a deep breath. She had booked the flight months ago, a decision she'd made with hope but also with hesitation. She glanced at the gate and then at her phone, where the news feed had already been flooded with stories of the latest storms sweeping through the area. But the weather at the airport was clear, and the plane was on time. Nearby, an older man named Walter shuffled slowly through the terminal, dragging his worn suitcase behind him. Walter had spent the last few months in Florida, chasing a dream that had slipped through his fingers. He was now heading back to his home in Oregon, unsure of what awaited him. He had come to Florida for adventure, but the loss of his wife had left him stranded in a place he didn't belong. Now, all he wanted was the comfort of his familiar surroundings, the quiet of the small town he had always known. Lily and Walter passed each other without so much as a glance. Both were strangers to each other, yet both were linked by the same flight, the same fate. As the moments ticked by, the gate began to fill with passengers, each carrying their own hopes and fears. The overhead announcement crackled, calling for final boarding. Lily stood up, adjusting her jacket, her fingers brushing against the fabric of her suitcase. She didn't know anyone on this flight, but that didn't matter. She found her seat by the window, settling in as the rest of the passengers filed in. Walter took his seat across the aisle, near the back of the plane. He looked out the window, squinting as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. The plane was full, but there was a quiet buzz of conversation, people chatting about their destinations, talking to the flight attendants, checking their phones one last time before the doors closed. A sense of routine hung in the air, the calm before the storm, though no one could know that yet. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and confident. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently on schedule for departure, and we expect smooth flying conditions ahead. We'll be cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet, and we should be arriving in Seattle in just under 5 hours. We thank you for flying with us today." Lily closed her eyes for a moment, leaning her head back against the seat. There was something reassuring about the captain's voice, the confidence he projected. It made her believe that everything would be fine, that the storm warnings she'd seen on her phone were nothing more than overblown media hype. This was just another flight, another journey that would pass by without incident. The plane taxied down the runway, and soon they were airborne, rising above the sprawling city below. The world outside the window seemed to shrink as the plane soared higher, the horizon stretching out into infinity. Lily felt the familiar sense of freedom that came with being in the air, the sense of detachment from the world below, where nothing could reach her, where the stresses of life could be momentarily forgotten. Walter, too, relaxed as the plane climbed higher, the hum of the engines becoming a steady rhythm that soothed his nerves. He hadn't been flying in years, but this flight felt different. It felt safe. He thought about his wife again, how she would have insisted on sitting by the window, pointing out the sights from above. But she was gone now, and he was left to navigate the journey alone. As the flight continued, the attendants came down the aisles with their carts, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. The sound of clinking cups and casual conversations filled the cabin. The flight was smooth, the sky a perfect blue, stretching endlessly above them. The only sign of any trouble came when the captain made another announcement, this time sounding a little more serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering a bit of light turbulence ahead," the captain said. "It should pass quickly, but for your safety, we ask that you remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." A few murmurs of concern rippled through the cabin, but most passengers remained calm. The turbulence was mild, a brief disturbance that hardly rattled the plane. Some passengers looked out the window, watching the clouds shift and churn, while others stared ahead, lost in thought. Lily's fingers gripped the armrest for a moment, but she quickly relaxed as the plane steadied once again. Walter glanced at the people around him, noticing the calm faces of his fellow passengers. The worry he had felt earlier seemed unnecessary now. Minutes passed, and the turbulence passed with it. The sky outside grew darker as the sun set, painting the clouds in shades of purple and orange. The soft glow of the cabin lights flickered on, and the crew began their rounds again, offering a second round of drinks to the passengers. The flight was peaceful once more, and the sense of routine returned. But somewhere far in the distance, the storm was still brewing. The passengers had no way of knowing that the calm they felt was only temporary, that the skies would soon fall silent in a way they could never have imagined. The plane sailed on, unaware of the fate awaiting it, as the night deepened and the world outside grew quieter still. The first sign of trouble came with a low, sudden rumble that seemed to shake the very bones of the plane. Passengers froze for a split second, then murmurs of concern rippled through the cabin. The fasten seatbelt sign flickered on, its harsh red light cutting through the dimness of the evening. The voice of the captain crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We are encountering severe turbulence. Our crew is doing everything we can to ensure your safety. Please stay calm." Lily's heart skipped a beat. She had heard of turbulence before, of course, but nothing like this. The seat beneath her buckled as the plane dipped violently, sending a jolt of panic through her chest. She gripped the armrests so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Across the aisle, Walter's face had gone pale. He hadn't been flying for years, and this was nothing like the calm flights he remembered. The turbulence wasn't light, as the captain had said. It was violent, with the plane pitching and yawing in the air. The lights flickered, dimming and brightening as the passengers clutched their seats. The rhythmic hum of the engines, once a comforting sound, now felt distant, muffled by the pounding of Lily's heart in her ears. Outside the window, the once clear sky had been swallowed by dark clouds, heavy and thick, swirling ominously. Suddenly, with a deafening crack, the plane lurched again, this time not from turbulence, but from something much worse. The entire cabin screamed as the plane twisted violently to the right, throwing passengers into the aisles. Bags flew from overhead compartments, and a child's frightened wail echoed through the cabin. The sound of metal groaning and cracking filled the air, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to stretch out of time. The world inside the plane was a blur of chaos, and the world outside seemed equally uncertain. Lily felt her stomach flip as the plane began to plummet, falling like a stone from the sky. For a brief moment, the silence was absolute, as though time itself had stopped. Her breath caught in her throat as the plane descended rapidly. She could hear nothing but the rush of wind outside the window. A cold sweat broke out on her skin as her mind struggled to make sense of what was happening. This can't be real, she thought. Planes don't fall. They don't just fall. Walter's eyes were wide with terror, his grip tightening on the armrests. He could hear the screams from the back of the plane, passengers' cries of panic and fear. For a moment, the thought of his wife flashed through his mind. He had always told her that flying was safe, that it was just like any other mode of transportation. But now, as the plane plummeted faster and faster, that belief was shaken to its core. The turbulence had become something worse, something they couldn't control, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this might be the end. The intercom crackled again, the captain's voice strained and urgent. "Prepare for impact. Brace yourselves." Lily's breath caught in her throat. She did as she was told, grabbing the seat in front of her and folding herself into the brace position, her head pressed against her knees, her arms crossed behind her neck. Around her, the other passengers followed suit, some crying, some praying, some frozen in terror. The thought of dying had never seemed so real, so close. The image of the plane crashing, of the world beyond the glass window shattering in an instant, gripped her mind. It was hard to focus on anything other than the pounding of her heart. Then, with a sound unlike anything she had ever heard, the plane hit the ground. It wasn't like a normal landing. There was no gradual descent, no soft touchdown on the runway. Instead, There was an explosion of noise and chaos, the roar of the plane's engines as they slammed into the earth. The plane was thrown sideways, the seats and passengers tumbling together in a chaotic mess of limbs and luggage. Metal screeched, and the terrible sound of crumpling fuselage filled the air. The smell of burning rubber and gasoline filled the cabin, and Lily tasted something sharp and bitter on her tongue. There was a sickening thud as the plane hit the trees, the force of the impact throwing everything into darkness. For a few moments, there was nothing but blackness. No sound. No light. The world had stopped. When Lily finally opened her eyes, everything was disorienting. Her body ached, her head spinning. She was lying against the cold, jagged edge of a seat, one arm tangled in a strap. The lights were out, the emergency exits glowing in a faint, eerie green. A thick silence had descended over the cabin. No more screams. No more crying. No more sounds of the engines. Just the occasional groan of the plane's crumpled structure, a soft hiss of steam escaping from somewhere. The world outside the shattered windows was dark, impossibly dark. For a long moment, Lily couldn't even remember where she was or how she had gotten here. Her mind felt slow, like it was trudging through thick mud. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through her side, and she gasped. Everything was broken, twisted, and strange. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold surface of the window, then the metal frame of the seat beside her. Walter, too, stirred beside her, his face bruised and bloodied. He blinked, dazed, his chest heaving as he fought to catch his breath. The silence around them felt suffocating, the stillness too deep for comfort. The crash had torn the plane apart, but in that stillness, something even more unnerving began to settle in, the profound quiet of a world suddenly gone still. Lily looked around at the other passengers. Some were unconscious, others barely moving. The cabin was wrecked, the seats torn from their fixtures, luggage scattered, but the silence remained. The storm outside was still there, the wind howling against the broken fuselage, but it felt like the crash had muted everything. The sky had, quite literally, fallen silent. The world they had known was gone. And in that silence, survival became the only thing that mattered. The silence was overwhelming, like the world had pressed the pause button and left them in a suspended state. For a moment, there was nothing but the low hum of distant wind and the soft creaks of the broken plane, but soon reality began to set in. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of burning fuel, filling their lungs with every breath. It was clear that the crash had torn the aircraft apart, and it would be a miracle if anyone had survived. Lily's heart raced as she struggled to sit up, her hands shaking. Her side ached with every movement, but the pain didn't matter. She had to move. She had to see if anyone needed help. Her fingers found the seat belt, and she released the clasp, wincing as she pulled herself upright. The cabin was a wreckage, seats scattered like toys in a child's playroom, luggage overturned, and the floor littered with debris. The air was thick with smoke, but it wasn't as suffocating as the silence that enveloped everything. Walter groaned beside her, his face pale as he slowly pushed himself up. He had a deep gash on his forehead, and his shirt was torn in places, but it was the dull shock in his eyes that struck Lily most. He was alive, but only just. He wasn't sure if his body was moving from instinct or sheer will, but he wasn't ready to give in to the silence, not yet. "Are you okay?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible against the oppressive stillness. Walter nodded slowly, his breath shallow. "I think so. But we need to get out of here. Now." Lily didn't need to be told twice. Her gaze flicked around the wreckage, her eyes locking onto the cracked emergency exit at the rear of the plane. She pushed herself toward it, her legs weak beneath her, the pain in her side now a constant reminder of what they had just survived. The sounds of the other passengers, once so full of life, were now absent. Some were moaning softly, others were eerily quiet, but there was no overwhelming panic, no chaos. It was as if the crash had stolen the energy from everyone in an instant. Lily felt a lump form in her throat, fear gnawing at the edges of her resolve. They needed help. But where were the rescuers? As they moved through the cabin, Lily spotted a family a few rows ahead, 2 children, one barely a toddler, the other no older than 6. The parents were unconscious, their faces bruised and pale. The children's cries were soft but desperate, a faint sound that somehow cut through the stillness like a knife. Lily's heart twisted, and she hurried toward them, her legs feeling like lead with every step. "Hey," she said softly, kneeling beside them. "Hey, it's okay. We're going to get you out of here." The younger child looked up, her tear-streaked face a picture of confusion and fear. She reached out with tiny hands, clinging to Lily's arm as if she understood the fragile promise being made. "Where's Mommy?" the older child asked, his voice breaking. Lily's heart clenched. She glanced at the unconscious parents, both of whom appeared to be alive, but their injuries were severe. She didn't know if they would make it. But there was no time for that kind of thinking. She needed to get them to safety. "We'll get her help," Lily promised, though she wasn't sure she could keep that promise. The plane had crashed far from any airport or populated area. There was no telling how far the nearest rescue team was, or even if one could reach them. Walter, who had been moving through the cabin to assess the damage, returned to her side. He looked down at the children and then back at her, his expression grim. "We can't stay here. We need to move. We're sitting ducks if we wait." Lily nodded, wiping a tear from her eye. She didn't want to leave the parents behind, but the truth was undeniable. They had to leave before the wreckage became even more dangerous. The noise of the storm outside had increased, the howling wind now a constant roar, and Lily could see the trees swaying violently through the broken windows. The crash site wasn't just remote, it was wild, untamed. They were in the heart of a forest, miles from any known civilization. Lily glanced back at the wreckage, her mind racing. She could see no signs of other survivors. It was as if they were the only ones left. The silence was no longer comforting, it was suffocating, oppressive. Every step they took away from the plane felt like they were walking farther into an unknown abyss, but it was their only choice. "All right," Walter said, snapping Lily from her thoughts. "We move. We have to find shelter, food, anything that will help us survive out here." With a deep breath, Lily nodded. The children clung to her sides, their small bodies trembling with fear. The reality of their situation was settling in now, and as much as she wanted to hold on to the hope that help would come soon, she couldn't afford to wait. They had to survive. Together, the survivors made their way out of the wreckage and into the dense forest. The crash site was a nightmare of twisted metal and broken wings, and every step they took felt like an eternity. The silence around them, so complete and deafening, made everything seem even more surreal. They could hear nothing but the rustling of the wind and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. It was as if the forest itself had closed in around them, hiding them from the rest of the world. They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the darkness, their minds never straying too far from the danger that lay ahead. With each step, they seemed to slip farther away from everything they had once known. But in that silence, there was no time for regret. There was only survival, only the raw, instinctual need to stay alive. And in the distance, barely visible through the trees, they saw a faint glimmer of light. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It could be the first sign of hope in a world that had gone quiet. They pressed on toward it, their hearts pounding in their chests as the struggle for survival began in earnest. The silence had not only stolen their sense of security, it had transformed them. They were no longer passengers on a plane. They were survivors in the wilderness, fighting for their lives. The journey through the forest was grueling. The thick underbrush scratched at their skin, the cold night air biting into their bones. Every step felt heavier than the last, each one dragging them further from the remnants of the plane, and closer into the wilderness. The silence of the forest, once overwhelming, now felt like a constant companion, wrapping around them like a suffocating shroud. Lily's legs ached, and she could feel the deep pain in her side, but she pushed forward, determined to protect the children and Walter. She had no choice. There was no way back to the wreckage, no time to stop and wait. The moment they'd stepped away from the plane, they had committed themselves to the unknown. Walter, who had taken the lead, stopped suddenly, his hand held out as though feeling the air. "Wait," he murmured. "Do you hear that?" The others paused, straining their ears. For a moment, there was nothing but the creaking of branches and the rustle of leaves. But then, in the distance, faint and almost indistinguishable from the howl of the wind, came a sound. The unmistakable hum of an engine. It was distant at first, a barely perceptible vibration in the air. But as it grew louder, a surge of hope rushed through them all. Rescue. It had to be. Lily's breath caught in her throat, and she turned to the children. "Stay close," she whispered, though the fear in her voice betrayed her calm words. The children clung to her side, their faces still pale but their eyes wide with the first glimmer of hope they had seen in hours. They pushed through the underbrush, moving faster now, their hearts beating in time with the growing sound of the engine. It was a helicopter, they realized. A rescue team. Help was coming. The sound grew louder with each passing second, the roar of the blades cutting through the air, drowning out the wind. It was like a dream. Lily could barely believe it. They had been stranded in the wilderness, lost, with no idea if anyone was even looking for them. But now, it felt as though the world was finally coming back to life. The silence was fading, being replaced by the unmistakable sound of salvation. As they stumbled into a small clearing, they saw it. The helicopter appeared through the trees, its lights flashing in the distance. It was low, hovering above the ground, its powerful blades slicing through the air with an urgent rhythm. Lily's heart soared. She wanted to run toward it, to throw herself at it, and let it carry her away to safety. But she forced herself to stay calm, to remember the others. The helicopter lowered its altitude, its bright lights illuminating the clearing. The wind from the blades whipped through the trees, sending leaves flying and branches creaking under the pressure. The sound was deafening, the roar of the helicopter now filling their ears in a way that felt almost surreal after so much silence. The crew aboard the helicopter quickly spotted them, their figures silhouetted against the dim lights of the helicopter. A voice boomed from the loudspeakers, crackling through the wind, urging them to hurry. "Get to the helicopter! Move now!" the voice shouted. Lily's legs, exhausted from the long trek, seemed to find new strength as she rushed toward the helicopter. Walter followed, carrying the older child, who had lost the strength to walk. The younger child clung to Lily's side, her tiny fingers gripping her shirt as though she feared letting go would mean being lost forever. As they reached the helicopter, the crew helped them aboard, lifting them one by one into the safety of the chopper. Walter was the last to board, helping the children climb in before him. The moment they were all inside, the doors slammed shut, and the helicopter began to rise, slowly at first, then faster, pulling them away from the wreckage below. Lily looked out the window, watching as the ground fell away beneath them, the forest shrinking until it was nothing more than a patchwork of green and brown. The forest that had once felt so vast, so unknowable, was now far behind them. They were no longer alone, no longer trapped in the silence of the wilderness. But the silence inside the helicopter was just as profound. It wasn't the heavy silence of the forest, or the chaos of the crash. It was a quiet filled with relief. The noise of the helicopter's blades was a new kind of sound, the sound of survival, of hope. Walter leaned back in his seat, exhausted but alive. He looked at the children, their faces now reflecting the exhaustion of everything they had been through, but also the relief of being out of danger. He glanced at Lily, who was still staring out the window, her face a mix of emotions, fatigue, fear, and a quiet, tentative joy. They had made it. They had survived. As the helicopter soared into the night sky, the noise of the world returned. The roar of the blades. The chatter of the crew. The soft sobs of the children as they finally allowed themselves to cry. The steady beat of Lily's heart, still racing with the intensity of what they had just experienced. The world was alive again, and with it came the understanding that they had been through something extraordinary. They had endured. They had fought through the silence, through the fear, and they had made it out alive. And as they flew towards safety, Lily couldn't help but wonder, what would become of the silence they had left behind? Would they ever truly escape it? Or had it, in some way, become a part of them, a memory of the time when everything had been different, when the world had stood still? In the distance, the sound of the helicopter blades grew louder. It was no longer just a reminder of survival, it was a promise of a new beginning. A beginning where the silence no longer ruled the world around them, where they could finally hear the sound of life again. And with that thought, Lily closed her eyes, letting the noise of the world sweep over her like a blanket, and she allowed herself to drift into sleep, knowing that they were safe.